following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. Hello, listeners on Saga 960 AM and those listening around the world on streaming and podcast services. This is It's Not Therapy. I'm Liana and I am not a therapist, but I am your source for practical advice for everyday problems using my top 10 sayings for checking in with your best self. Tonight, well, I was supposed to be off last week, meaning I'd planned to catch up on a bunch of stuff. Instead, I got COVID, and I'm still not feeling the best, so I may cough this episode. I am in a lousy mood. I am warning everybody right now. And the irony of the topic that we're discussing this episode based on the dialogue surrounding COVID isn't lost on me. What does it really mean to be reasonable and rational? Now, why do I say that this is ironic? Well, for a bunch of reasons. I mean, I said this before I got COVID. I did this before the week off, thanks Ty Cat's game. But from the beginning of the pandemic, there have been numerous wars of words regarding what responses are reasonable regarding this whole pandemic thing. Some people thought it was reasonable to take over a residential neighborhood in Ottawa and blast truck air horns loud enough to damage human hearing around children because they thought that vaccine and mask mandates were unreasonable. I don't agree with this, and I agree even less now that I've gotten this mild version of COVID after 3 vaccinations. I'm still coughing after 10 days. I don't have my sense of smell or taste back. My ability to think is impaired. I have the brain fog. So. Is it reasonable to expect me to sit back and listen to people complain about freedom when I've lost 2 of my 5 senses? No, I don't think so. But who's right? There's no ultimate judge of that with these things, right? Worse, the words reasonable and rational mean different things to different people in different contexts. So I'm going to take you through a brief primer on reason and reasonableness this episode in the hopes it'll encourage better conversations going forward, because the way people are trying to solve problems these days, big picture, just isn't sustainable. Also, I didn't want to take people's questions this week because 1, I'm in a foul mood. 2, brain fog, not fair to the questioners. But I did pre-record an interview before I got sick, and I was in a much better mood there. So Dr. Mike Brooks, a psychologist currently working on a book on polarization, will be here for the interview to talk to us about reasonableness in a much sunnier frame of mind. But here we go. The show must go on. What is reason? What does it mean to be reasonable? Well, ask a regular person and you'll get an answer like a cause or explanation or the ability to think using logic. Everyone has reasons for what they do, but some reasons contain more reason than others. See the different use of the term? Now ask a philosopher what reason is. Capital R reason, and you get a different answer. Reason in philosophy is the process of drawing inferences using logic. Reason isn't treated as the same thing as experiential knowledge in philosophy. It's basically the ability to synthesize new ideas. And some people think this sort of thinking is ideal, as opposed to, forming your opinions based on experiences or emotions primarily. And those people that believe that reason is the ideal way to form morality is a philosophical movement called rationalism. Now, the opposite is something called empiricism, which is basing your decisions only on what can be observed. how you feel, how it impacts you. Essentially, it's I'll believe it when I see it thinking. It's the rejection of abstraction. Now, philosophy has battled it out between these two schools of thought, rationalism and empiricism, all the way back to the ancient Greeks. Guys like Pythagoras, Plato, Aristotle, those dudes are credited with codifying the concept of reason, even though the Confucians actually got to the whole thing slightly earlier. And by slightly, I mean about 200 years. What's history when it's a good story, right? Don't know why people worship the Greeks. Oh yeah, it's convenient and it feels good. Bad mood. Moving on, Liana. Okay. When most people talk about being reasonable, they're actually talking about being empiricists, observing what's happening in front of them and responding to their take on the situation, their own emotions, and the emotions of the people around them. And you might be thinking, who cares? And I'm with you there. It's hard to care about this stuff with everything that's going on right now, but the lack of understanding this divide is a big part of the reason the world is so nuts right now. Pardon the ableist language. Everyone has their reasons for doing and thinking things. But people get divided along empiricist versus rationalist priorities regarding those reasons. Let's circle back to the COVID freedom versus safety fight, right? And I'll believe it when I see it type of thinker prioritizes the restrictions on movement and mask requirements, which are things they directly experience, over the logical probability of catching a virus if they don't take precautions. The inference that getting sick is worse than the restrictions, even though it's not guaranteed, isn't something their minds process. Now, scientists out there are going, wait, I'm an empiricist, but no, this is crazy. Yes, but that's the knowledge that they've had based on the scientific education. If somebody doesn't have that experiential knowledge, they fall prey to the internet. And so their point of view sounds nuts to either someone who has that experiential knowledge through science or someone who thinks in abstractions, right? The idea of getting a virus with the potential to rob you of the ability to taste food is for many the greater of evils compared to some inconveniences and less socializing. And trust me, as somebody who that idea of losing your taste and smell is now a reality, oh, I was so right. Now, both types of thinkers have reasons for their views. That's important to understand despite my Hulk level rage here, because bridging this ideological gap is extremely difficult, if it's possible at all. Again, people have been fighting about this stuff for thousands of years. How are we possibly supposed to solve it now? Because it's not just that people think different things. It's that people think in different ways. Both empiricism and rationalism have their place, right? Obviously, empirical evidence, as I said, is important in the sciences. But the ability to use logical inferences is useful in deciding why we should do some things over other things. And this is where we get into moral reasoning, the stuff at the core of the massive cultural fights we're having over lots more than COVID lockdowns. The very word ideology triggers a lot of people right now, especially on certain topics. Gender ideology, the gay agenda, feminism, Black Lives Matter. I can practically hear some listeners squirming right now. And you know what? They all have their reasons. And people don't like to think that their reasons might not be very good ones, that their reasons might not be totally reasonable. So they stack reasons upon reasons, piling up anecdotes and examples, empirical evidence that they usually get from the internet, so that they can seem reasonable. While what they're really responding to is the danger warning centers in their brain lighting up like crazy. That's really what's driving a lot of people. But if those danger warning centers in your brain are going crazy and causing you to act in ways you normally wouldn't, remember, I don't support crazy when it's hurting you. When we come back, more on this, but I want to pause right now, in part so I can blow my freaking nose. But also, I just need a cough break. Yeah, bad mood, Hulk smash. It's not therapy, and I am Liana Kersner. I am not in a good mood. I hate being sick. Back in a bit.
The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca.
We're back on It's Not Therapy. I am Liana Kersner. I am allegedly recovering from COVID, and we're talking reasonableness. What is it? And what does it mean when your reasons aren't reasonable? Every period of social upheaval, like the one we're in now, has had these catchphrases and moral permission structures that let terrified people convince themselves that they're being reasonable when, like I said before the break, what they're actually having is a strong danger emotional reaction. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with having that emotional reaction. It's there for a reason. Reason. It's just important that we make sure we can tell the difference. We maintain the ability to tell the difference between emotions and logic, because they do different things in different ways at different speeds, and it's really important to tell them apart. As a culture, catchphrase, we claim to value reason, rationality. But as individuals, we're really not good some of the time at recognizing that our reasoning, when it comes right down to it, is logical thinking in accordance with our morals. But our morals have a deeply emotional component. And that's okay. In fact, that's good, as long as you recognize that and put it in its proper place. We have the most educated human population in history right now. And like I said, I'm in a bad mood. I'm going to get real here right now. All that's created is a bunch of very stupid people with college degrees. The educational focus on regurgitation of facts, that empirical school, didn't teach people how to reason. Now, reasoning is hard. You make a lot of mistakes in reasoning. And so a lot of people don't want to do it. And that's why, quote unquote, critical thinking has become looking down our various identity group noses at outgroups. Why does that matter? Why am I ranting? Well, all a bad faith actor or political operative has to do, and some might say they're the same thing, all some sort of operative that way has to do is convince some group of people that something is coming for their children, and they can make them do whatever they want. It's really that simple. Because it's completely reasonable to want to protect children. The much more difficult problem is how and from what. Now, while I was sick for 10 freaking days, I read a lot about the Pope's penitent visit to Canada regarding the Indigenous residential schools. You will hear sarcasm. If I want a living embodiment of some sort of god to be sorry about stuff, I'll go watch a Thor movie. He's always very Thory. Ha, 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 ha. I'm not Catholic. So, a lot of the wordsmithing and philosophy surrounding papal bulls and these decrees and all this stuff, it just doesn't land with me. And I try to be respectful because I know people believe in this stuff deeply. But to me, they're excuses the church historically made to grab land and get rich. The bad side of rational reason during the Enlightenment. Empirically, though, I see that repealing the doctrine of discovery is very important to some Indigenous people and their supporters. And for some Catholics, it's very important that it not be repealed because it's apparently not used anymore and popes don't repeal things. They just are for things until they're against it. Yes, I'm being sarcastic. Again, I'm not Catholic. Apologies to Catholics. Belief is difficult this way. I'm very happy to listen to those who have a different point of view on this stuff. I have my own religious nonsense, right? But what I did read and watch through the news were a lot of accounts with the residential schools of really bad things that adults did to kids in those schools, which to me sound more like indoctrination camps. And I don't care what the reasons were behind it. I know there were reasons. I've read about the reasons. I don't care. It was one group trying to destroy the culture of another group and claim it was moral. I wouldn't want somebody showing up, forcing me to change everything about my way of life, making me speak a different language, and doing some horrendously abusive stuff while they were allegedly trying to civilize me. But let's be reasonable. Oh, there's that weaponized phrase. Let's be reasonable, designed to just gaslight any emotional response somebody could possibly have, right? So I'm already pissed off about this stuff. Then I read about hockey. Hockey Canada. Apparently teens were getting abused there too. Also Gymnastics Canada. And why should we be surprised that it was happening in Gymnastics Canada? It happened in the US with US Gymnastics as well. Hear me out, I'm going somewhere with this. Like I said, I didn't want to take people's questions, but there is advice at the end of this bitter, bitter rainbow, okay? It seems like every major organization with a duty of care for children and teens has some element within that organization that uses that trust to abuse kids instead of nurture them. There are supposed to be structures and systems in place that make sure this stuff does not happen. And yet it continues to happen. And since I was sick for way over a week, I had a lot of time to think about this. Then I started feeling somewhat better. So I tried getting back on social media. And almost immediately I was reminded of the whole groomer libel against gay and trans people. And I got really, really angry. Like Hulk level angry. And I maintain, and I'm going to try to prove this to you, that anger was a reasonable response. Reasonable assumption. Anyone who isn't a complete sociopath cares about the well-being of children and agrees that children should be protected and nurtured. Reasonable people also recognize that while you can't treat a teenager like a child, they're not quite an adult either, so you have to give them gradually more freedom and autonomy while still looking out for them. The problem is, what does that look like in real terms? Some people believe it means that you shouldn't let kids know that gay and trans people exist. And you shouldn't let teenagers take any control over their own identities because that leaves them vulnerable to the gay and trans ideology, which is a terrible, no good, very bad thing, even though individual gay and trans people may or may not be fine people. Sarcasm, 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 yeah. Recently in the US, a political official referred to the rape of a 10-year-old girl that resulted in a pregnancy as an opportunity for that young woman. Is it reasonable for a 10-year-old girl to be thought of as a woman? You might think so, I don't. This 10-year-old girl was taken to another state where anti-abortion trigger laws weren't in effect. So this 10-year-old girl wasn't forced to give birth due to the complementarian gender ideology of some people that the rightful place of a woman in this world is as a mother. It's the same complementarian gender ideology that insists women can't be priests in the Catholic faith. See where I'm looping around with this? Because complementarian gender ideology reasons. And this is the part that makes me angry. Unless you're in favor of banning youth hockey, gymnastics, and Catholicism, don't start with me about banning mentions of same-sex families and trans people. Not sexual practices, the people. The people. Because sports and religion reach way more kids than LGBTQ plus groups. So if you're trying to ban one of these things because some bad people did some bad things to some kids, but you're not trying to ban the other much bigger groups where some bad people did some bad things to some kids, you are not being reasonable. And yet, that's the majority of opinion in a lot of places right now. And people have their reasons. People have their reasons even when they're completely unreasonable. This is what formal logic, reason, and empathy is supposed to prevent. But all that stuff's been hijacked by the think of the children emotional first principle. The problem is that we're not collectively thinking of the children here. We're feeling for the children. And of course we are. Of course we are. What monster wouldn't? These political gambits are designed to make us feel strongly because certain heightened emotional states hijack our ability to reason in the philosophical sense, infer things based on logic. Instead, we just get hyper-focused on dealing with what's right in front of us right now. Make the bad, scary thing go away. Make the bad, hateful thing go away. Let's not stop and think about this. No, just get rid of it. And here's the truly revolting thing about the tactic, and this is the thing that makes me angry, because it preys on people who can't abstract. Preys on empiricists to stop empiricists from having direct experiences with gay and trans people. Precisely so that they can't see with their own eyes and hear with their own ears that these are people, not scary monsters. These policies, these anti-trans and gay ideologies, want to get in the way of people forming their own opinions about LGBTQ plus individuals, because it's way, way easier to just get your head around the whole transgender and non-binary thing when you actually get the opportunity to talk to people who have had that experience. And yeah, we're seeing a rise in people identifying as trans and non-binary right now. That is empirical fact. Not because they're being converted, because now people have words for their experience. It's a good thing. So, while you might find drag queen story time to be weird, I'm sorry, it's not dangerous and it's not sexualizing children. No, it's not. That claim isn't reasonable, and here's why it's not reasonable. If a drag queen reading a book is a sexual act, then a regular old woman reading a book is a sexual act. And of course, a woman just reading a book is not a sexual act. Be reasonable. And this is where I'm going to get the emotional reactance. I don't want to. You're not my parent. I want to have feelings. You can't make me. Yes. Yes, wanting to have feelings is completely reasonable. Wanting time to catch up with these changes is completely reasonable. And reasonable people in the LGBTQ plus movement get that. It's completely unreasonable to expect that everyone with a particular viewpoint is going to come to that view from a reasoned perspective. So stop using the kooks, stop using the outliers as an excuse to avoid having a more open mind. And that's the advice this segment. Stop it. Stop fighting over nonsense. Step back and look at what you're saying, as well as how you're saying it, and examine whether you think another person would be being reasonable if they were behaving in the way that you are. It's one thing to believe something is nonsense. It's another thing entirely to believe something is nonsense and be an entitled jerk about it. If, for instance, you believe so strongly that vaccine mandates are morally wrong, you should be able to stand on your principles and be prepared to accept the consequences of that point of view. Oh, poor thing, you can't board a commercial form of mass transit. You can't cross the border. There are limits based on your choices. Right? I'm not saying this as somebody who is not prepared to get the exact same thing. I'm prepared to get called a groomer and a pedophile sympathizer. That's happened because I support transgender rights. It's not reasonable to expect no consequences for this stuff. Now, I know I'm being openly supportive of people that not everybody gets yet. But it's also not reasonable, at least in my mind, not to speak my mind about this stuff just because of the name calling. I know it's not true. I know I'm not a groomer. I know I'm not a pedophile sympathizer. It's ridiculous. But I also know it's not true that sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. Names hurt. That's why name calling works. But while I may have lost my literal sense of smell and taste thanks to COVID, I can still recognize and detect BS. And I won't give up my reason to avoid certain conflicts, to avoid, the lack of approval from people I don't feel are reasonable. These are the choices we make in life. At least we make them if we want a fulfilling life. And that's what this show's about. Helping you make these choices, helping you combine the facts, the empirical facts of your personal day-to-day reality with reasoned responses, reasoned practical responses, so that you can feel better and do better. So thank you for letting me rant. When we come back, we're going to morale boost. We're going to boost the tone. It's going to be happier. Dr. Mike Brooks joins us for the interview. A much happier interview. What can I say? I still don't feel great. Hooray for pre-records. When we come back on It's Not Therapy.
The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. It's time once again on It's Not Therapy for the interview. And guys, I have an actual therapist this week. Dr. Mike Brooks has a private practice in Austin, Texas. He's a psychologist. He's the author of a book called Tech Generation. He talks about screen use, but that's not what we're talking to Dr. Mike about this episode. We're talking to him about the concept of reasonableness, of rationality, of what it actually means. And Mike, you have a fantastic article on anger management on your website that I absolutely just loved. Everyone is angry. Everyone sometimes, as you say, everyone loses their cool sometimes.
Right.
It's a valid emotion. And people really struggle between these two extremes, I find, that either no emotions ever, we all have to be a cross between a Vulcan and a computer. I find when people say reasonable or rational, they actually mean dispassionate.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't lead to good choices. The other extreme is just blowing up, freaking out. Best defense is a strong offense, and that doesn't work either. So in your practice, in your speaking, how do you define that sort of middle way, that rational middle ground?
Well, that's a big packed question. But I think one is, the first thing that comes to mind is that we want to respond versus react. So, sure, if we're walking on a trail and we see a snake in front of us, we want to react and not respond. But in most of our day-to-day interactions, when emotions well up, they can overwhelm us and sort of dictate what we do or say. Mm-hmm. And it's fueled by this emotion. And oftentimes when we cool off, we realize we shouldn't have said certain things or texted certain things. Mm-hmm. And one of the best pieces of advice I've ever heard on that was from the Dalai Lama. I'm a super fan of the Dalai Lama. And I forget which book, I think it was one about managing anger. And he said, our true self is when we're calm. That's who we most are, is when we're in a calm state. And he said, when we get angry, we often do and say things that are inconsistent with who we truly are. Because when we cool off, then we're like, oh man, I shouldn't have said that. I shouldn't have chosen those words, or, whatever, or even texting, we've all done that. An email, we fire off that angry email. And after we cool off and we're like, oh man, I should not have said that. So his advice really resonated with me, and it was pretty simple. He said, when we're really angry, we shouldn't do or say much of anything until we cool off, because it's likely we'll say something or do something that's inconsistent with who we truly are. Mm-hmm. So get calm down first, and rarely do we have to act or say in that very moment. Oftentimes we have, especially over text, if we're feeling angry, so we got to name it to tame it, as Dr. Dan Siegel said. So we recognize the emotion and we say, wow, I'm really jacked up right now. Let me not make any big decisions. Let me not say anything right now. Let me just cool off first. My most important responsibility is to manage my emotion, get in a state of calm, which would be consistent with who I truly am as a person. Mm-hmm. And now I can do and say things that are consistent with who I am, and not this other person where it's almost like we're possessed by, anger, and we become enraged, and almost like, and we'll even say stuff sometimes. I'm sorry, that wasn't me. I wasn't myself. Mm-hmm. What does that mean? Who else were you? No, but we got almost possessed. Our brains got hijacked by our limbic system. Our prefrontal cortex got knocked offline. Suddenly we're saying all these things, and we cool off later and we're like, oh my gosh, that was not the way to go. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if that covers some of the territory that you were asking.
It does. And it leads me to another phenomenon that I'm sure you've seen: people who are not able to name their feelings, so they can't tame their feelings. People know being angry is bad because of all this media talk about anger management, right? People know being angry is bad, but they don't really know what it's like to actually be calm. A lot of people walk around in a heightened state almost all the time these days. And so people can't name it, so they can't tame it. Someone is clearly acting in a state of not chill, and they're insisting, right, I'm perfectly calm, as they just told off that person, at the burger place drive-through.
Right.
How do you begin to work with someone like that? Because there are a lot of people that are saying, I'm just stressed all the time. I see a news headline, that's it, I'm done for the day. How do you do anything productive with someone who is just literally not aware of what they're feeling?
Well, starting place is always ourselves. Like, we can only be responsible for our own state of consciousness. So instead of like looking at what other people are doing, I have to look in the mirror and say, how am I doing it managing my own anger? Mm-hmm. Another Buddhist monk, you've heard of Thich Nhat Hanh, and I really love his stuff too. And one of the things he said, we have to be peace to make peace. So if I'm walking around angry and frustrated at, the Trumpers and the MAGA this, or those libtards that, or whatever, and I'm walking around in this state of anger, I'm part of the problem now. Mm-hmm. I cannot do good in the world and make peace in the world and help move things forward when I am bringing such levels of anger to the equation. So we always have to start with ourselves. And I'd say, Jesus said, don't pick at the splinter in your brother's eye when there's a plank in your own, to quote another wisdom teacher. and that's, I think, where we always have to start. So as we're looking around at the world being angry and social media, people being angry, is to say, well, I don't want to be part of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
How can I be the change that I want to see in the world, to, quote Gandhi there?
Mm-hmm.
And how do I be peace? How do I find peace? What do I need to do in my day to kind of get centered? What gives me peace? Like, look back at our own lives and say, for me, it's exercise. Like, I trail run, I go,
very
out
nice.
in nature, and I'll put on a good podcast or an audio book, sometimes music or sometimes silence. And I just, run. And, I have certain people I talk to if I'm like jacked up about politics that I vent to. And that helps kind of catharsis. But I have to look at my own life, say, when do I feel most at peace, at centered? What do I go to and say, I need to make sure I have those in my life every day, those go-to things, like we're prescribing it to ourselves like medicine.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up the whole culture war, left versus right thing. And we talk about how much screen time is too much for our kids, and violent video games, and, fictional media narratives, but we don't talk enough about the example people are setting in allegedly fact-based conversations, right? All of our news is now delivered to us in this highly combative, theatrical, beat up on the other guy instead of having a discussion where you sort of meet in the middle.
Right.
We're bombarded with examples of what not to do. And it gets very, very difficult to remember, no, that's not how you talk to people.
Right.
How do we know what's right when we get so many examples that get paid a lot of money for doing it wrong?
Well, complicated question. I'd say we have to look toward what brings the good in us and go more toward that, kind of extending on what I said before. Is I always like that. I don't know if you've heard the story of like the two wolves, and it was I think I heard it from Joseph Campbell originally, but it's like a Native American story where the grandfather was talking to the grandson and explaining how in each of us there are two wolves, one of evil and one of good, and they're constantly at war. And the wolf of evil is of, greed and malice and cruelty and jealousy, envy. And the wolf of good is of compassion and kindness and love and acceptance and patience. And the grandfather was like, these wolves are constantly at war. And the grandson says, well, which wolf wins? And the grandfather said, the wolf we feed. So, I always think of, how do I feed my good wolf? What brings out the good in me, and what makes me jacked up and makes me crazy? And social media is one of those, as you're pointing out. It's because the nature of the beast is the outrage trends, the loud voices, the polarized all or nothing thinking, attacking. And it's like, these bullies have a bullhorn now, a megaphone, and that what gets the clicks, what gets the eyeballs, what gets the shares, and all this. And to realize all of this is kind of insanity. It's making us all collectively crazy. But rather than like, I can't change social media. And I quote a lot of things. There's a line from a U2 song, I can't change the world, but I can change the world in me. So I can't change social media, but I can limit the amount of time I spend on it, find which types make me crazy. There are things you can do on, like if it's Twitter, of, that you only see comments of people who follow you, there's all sorts of things. And I tweaked that one, and that sure helped, because I would get jacked up. I'd say something that I thought was reasonable, and someone attack me, and I'm like, what, and then I'm like, fire back. And then I'm like, no, I can't do that. So, like the news, reading the news, and say, take off the apps of your phone of all the news, like get the local paper, I mean, that'd be one way, is quit reading the news, because now we're so polarized. We look at these headline news things and it's like we're disconnected from local events, which are less polarizing than these big, national narratives that are going on. And so we have to, it's kind of garbage in, garbage out. We have to look at these things and say, well, what can I do in my life that feeds my soul, that brings out the good in me? And what are the things that make me nuts and crazy? Because it's within all of us, the good and bad. Those two wolves are within each of us. And we have to make some decision. We have to step back from it all. And this is where kind of the mindfulness, or in more Eastern thinking, the third eye, where we're kind of the observing self and watching is like, what makes me crazy? Forget everybody else. Ask ourselves what what brings out the good in me. And then we got to prescribe it for ourselves and say, I need to construct my life every day so that I can feed my soul in ways, and that I limit the things that make me nuts.
I work with some people, very accomplished people, who you ask them, what's the good in me? What brings out the good in me? They say nothing. They don't see any good in them. They feel like it's a choice between feeling powerless and feeling angry. And so obviously in that one, the angry feels temporarily better than the powerless. How do people who have trouble connecting to the good, who just feel so powerless, they can't connect to that? What are some suggestions for first steps that they can do to feel good?
I think the most power we have, the greatest thing is connection, our relationships, and that they, for everyone, if we look at what makes us happy in life, and there's a huge body of research on this, once we meet our basic needs for food, water, shelter, and stuff like that, it's relationships. And basically, the equation is the healthier relationships we have, the stronger and healthier, the happier we are. So I would say, as we invest in relationship and connect with people whom we like and care about, build up. And if you don't have that, you need to work on that. I would say, don't focus, I'm just going to get rid of anger, I'm going to just transcend it somehow. Is say, love is powerful. I think it can heal a lot of deep wounds. And we get that through our relationships. And we know this to be true because if we look at our happiest times in life, if we reflect, it's always about relationship. It's like, well, when I travel with my family or when with a friend, I did this. No one will say, the happiest times in my life is when I'm in bed and I'm reading CNN headlines on my phone. Those are my bliss moments. I am so blissed out when I do that. No, we were like, oh, when I went to the beach with friends, we'll have a family game night, you name it. But it'll have to do with people. And if we look at our unhappiest times in life, they all have to deal with relationship too, which means alienated, isolated, teased, bullied, harassed, criticized, treated with contempt, divorce, death, our best friend moves away, various types of losses like that. Those all have to deal with relationships. So we know what's true. The research bears this out, but we don't even need to see the research. We can look within ourselves and see that the deepest level of happiness comes from connection. And so our best bet to be happy in life is foster relationships, invest in our relationships, do things, experience the world and engage, but do it with people. And that's our best bet. And my belief is that heals us, whatever our wounds are, our anxiety, depression, anger, is that connection is what heals us.
All right, Dr. Mike Brooks. I could talk to you forever, which is why I'm wrapping myself up now, because it's like little bit or so much. You can check out Dr. Mike's book, Tech Generation. He insists it was from 2018, so it's sort of not current. It's still good. It's still solid, guys. So, Mike, how else can people get in touch with you, find out what you're doing? What's the best way to find out what you're up to?
My website is Dr. Mike Brooks, drmikebrooks.com, Brooks. And then I'm on Twitter at Dr. Mike Brooks, which is, like a double-edged sword of Twitter.
That's how I found you. So Twitter's
yeah, I know.
Great for me. Yeah.
See, look, good things come from Twitter, and it can happen. But I think we both have been mindful of how we use it, using it mindfully and strategically, and not mindlessly. But Twitter, and then someone wants to email me, it's drmikebrooks@drmikebrooks.com. Can shoot me an email if you have, follow-up questions or something. But, I really enjoyed this conversation, Liana. And, I think we're both on the same path. Hopefully everyone listening is too, and got some ideas that might help on that journey.
Wasn't that great? So much more uplifting. Listening back on that, wow, relevant to my current state, right? We're going to go to a break, wrap up real quick when we come back. Few more minutes left. It's not therapy. Stay tuned. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. Okay, we've got like 90 seconds left to wrap. And moral of this episode is it's impossible to talk about reason and reasonableness without referencing politics in the media, because let's face it, it's what we're all fighting against in the quest to regain our sanity, right? Now, I'm going to leave you on a bright spot. Bright spot for me being sick, or as a, cast off of me being sick. As Dr. Mike Brooks said, it's about relationships. During this past period, people who know me well, people who don't know me that well, they cared. They cared that I've been feeling crummy, and they've been understanding. They've been patient. Even when I haven't responded to their DMs because I've been avoiding social media because I had to, because irony, it's always funny when I say something before a guest does, and the whole fact that I stayed off social media because I didn't trust what I was going to say. And that indicates an element of reasonableness, right? Know where you are, be able to name your feelings, and, try to be your best self even when you're not at your best. That's not a bad platitude to wrap things up off the cuff. All right, everybody, thanks for listening. Back next week, hopefully at full strength, talking about permission structures. Next week. Till then, remember, your crazy is only a problem if it's hurting you. Thanks for listening.